Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to officially show 1 of No More, No Less, this new podcast that I'm trying. I'm your host, Michael, and the reason for the name of the podcast, No More, No Less, is the more I learn, the more I investigate the ideas that I have and the concepts that I think are true, the more I realize that they're not, or they're only partially right. And I'm always forced to change my opinion and realize that we really don't know a lot about the world that we live in, and we kind of just do our best. And I really have always enjoyed the quote by Socrates, actually 2 of them. One is, the only true wisdom is in knowing that you know nothing. And another is, it is better to change an opinion than to persist in a wrong one. And I think in this world, in these days right now, I think we have too much certainty and not enough curiosity. And so I figured I would give this show a shot. And so I decided the first episode is going to be my experience doing a assisted MDMA therapy in 2019, because I came out of that actually realizing there was certain dimensions to life that I was completely unaware of. So thankfully, I have an excellent friend who agreed to do this first show with me. Her name is Kendra Hollidge. She's a therapist in Waterloo, Ontario. We've been friends for many, many years, 20 plus now. And I guess I'll let you introduce yourself and what you do, and maybe.
Sure. Happy to be here on your first podcast. I'm Kendra. So I've been practicing psychotherapy. I have a private practice here in Kitchener, which, for people who don't know, that's near Toronto, Ontario. Most people don't know KW. So I work mostly with trauma, and specifically with the lens of attachment, so family of origin. I work a lot with folks who've had childhood trauma, and work with kids and adults. So do a wide variety of stuff in the mental health field. My side passion project, I'm also the director of mental health advocacy with the Trauma and Embodiment Association of Ontario. And we work a lot with more marginalized communities around getting access to trauma services in more of an embodied approach, meaning kind of working from a more, when we say embodied, meaning holistic, and kind of how our bodies hold on to trauma and how that can come out. So this topic is really interesting to me, Mike, because I think we hold a lot of things in our subconscious and in our body specifically, and through maybe different types of therapies, we can access things that maybe we wouldn't be able to in just pure talk therapy. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Interesting. Thanks. I think with the pandemic and all sorts of things, if we're talking about social political upheaval, or pandemics and people being stressed, I think the last few years has added a lot of internal trauma for a lot of people. And I was actually listening to a podcast today on the Huberman Lab, and they were talking about trauma and how people think it doesn't have to just be violent trauma or domestic abuse or sexual abuse or things like that. Like life itself can be a bit of a trauma if you're bullied as a kid, or the way we interact with our caregivers, like there's all these things that I think now are being associated with like micro traumas, that they're not like these PTSD things that make us go too inward, but they may make us look at the world and process the world differently than we would have otherwise outside of those scenarios. So I guess
100%.
To talk about why I decided to do the assisted MDMA therapy, because it is illegal in Canada and in all countries, actually. I think Portugal's decriminalized drugs, but again, it's not legal anywhere. There are trials right now that I think in the next couple of years it will be legalized for certain protocols. But I'd done talk therapy probably since I was in my mid to late 20s. Like the tumultuous time, like what are you going to do with your life and all of these things, at least for me. And I always found talk therapy fairly helpful. Like I think maybe you can speak to this. It really depends on the therapist. Some of them you just don't gel with, or some of them you can tell they're trying to push some of their agenda or their own life trauma onto you. And you have to hopefully realize like this person is, a little bit toxic. I need to exit out of this relationship. And I did read someone's, I can't remember who it was, but someone's experience with the assisted MDMA therapy. And they said they kind of had reached the end of the line with therapy as well. Like they said that they had a significant amount of trauma in their life from, I think, like sexual abuse when they were a child and all these things. And so they did talk therapy, meditation, journaling, yoga, like the list goes on and on. But there was just a point that they reached that they realized they can't go anymore. And so they decided to do this therapy. And so even this weekend, I was having a discussion about this topic with someone, and they said, well, I guess I went inward about my life 500 times because the person I met had done an exorbitant amount of MDMA. And my point to them was like, well, the experience is different because the context is different. Like if you're, it's just like if you're, this is probably not a great example, but like if you're drinking and you're at a party and, you're with your friends and you're dancing and you're having a good time, that experience is a lot different than if you're really sad and you're at home and you're drinking by yourself. Like those are not the same experiences, even though the substance is the same.
Yeah. And intention, right? Like what's the intentionality behind the substance use? So, we talk about that in the harm reduction world too, right? Is kind of the precursors to using any substance is what's happening even before that. Right. So what I've loved about some of the stuff I've learned about the drug assisted therapies is I think when done well, it's done in a very controlled way, in a very held way, with, in terms of environment, the people there, like the safety, the harm reduction around it. Right. I think is critical. I will not pretend to be a expert on that, but I'm definitely, it's becoming more of at least in North America, we're learning more. It's becoming more of I think up and coming modality. Right. And when you were speaking about trauma, the thing that popped into my head, a couple of things popped in my head when you were speaking about therapy. And I agree with you. You said the word relationship. And I think that's so critical when you're doing any type of therapy, is that you have a good relationship with the therapist that you're working with. Because without that, it doesn't matter what they're using. It has to be that trust there. It has to be that kind of like best fit, right? That you feel comfortable enough with them to kind of go where you need to go. And if there's not that trusting relationship there, it's just not going to take you where you need to be. So that's critical. And then the other thing I was thinking when you were speaking is how when I was kind of talking my intro, there's so much we don't know about how the body holds on to emotion and how the brain processes emotion. And a lot of the work in like EMDR, which is a therapy that we use often in trauma. And it, to be honest, like when I first learned about it, I was like, this is weird. Like, sure, this is wacky, right? It's very odd in terms of the protocol. Like for those who don't know, it's like there's a tapping kind of component in how you recall traumatic memories. And the idea is you're taking the trauma from more of the midbrain, the emotional part of the brain, and bringing it up into the cortex where you can process and have more of a kind of a cognitive kind of intellectual understanding of it. So it's not held so much in the like the emotional part of the brain.
Right.
So that's like the theory behind it. And just how we don't really know a lot about how
I
hold
think
on to things.
like these are the modalities that are coming out in full force now. Whereas like, I don't know, the more I read and experience these things, I realize like we really are two selves. Like we're our limbic system, our emotional system, but then we're also very much like the frontal lobe, the planning, the thinking, that sort of being. And many times we have to reconcile these two sides that don't often get reconciled. It's like if if you happen to end a relationship, like this happened maybe 10 years to me. I ended a relationship with someone, and intellectually I realized that it was a very good decision. There were reasons we shouldn't be together, yada, yada, yada. But I felt like this deep crushing sense of loss. And I think that's when I started seeing like doing talk therapy for like a period of 6 months, and which really, really helped. Because there were just concepts I didn't understand of like the grieving process and all of these different things. But EMDR even, and I have friends who've done EMDR that actually have like PTSD, sort of traumatic experiences in their life, and it's helped them to recode those memories.
Exactly. It's a good word for it.
I was really shocked when they said how helpful it's been for them. So I think this is like we're on the precipice of a wholly new era of therapy. So the talk therapy will lead people to be prescribed into like an MDMA or I'm not going to mention any of the drugs. I don't know. I'm not going to say like a ketamine because I really don't know what those things do.
But it's really, it's up and coming. Yeah.
Right. Or a psilocybin or other these things. So like how now we would go to our GP, for example, and they say, oh, you have an eye problem. You should go see an ophthalmologist. Or, oh, you've got a gastro problem. Let's go get you a scope. And they send you. So maybe the talk therapist at one point will be like the hub to send people to different specializations. And then they come back to do their what's called integration work after the experience. Because like, what are you hearing in your I guess in your peer groups with therapists talking about these new psychedelic therapies that are?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was actually at a work retreat this weekend with a group of therapists, which is always interesting when you get a group of therapists together, the conversations.
Oh, those old times.
It's like no other. Man. Let me tell you, we get right in there. We're like two feet in the building and already going into deep places. But anyway, one of my colleagues was talking about, we were talking about some like, the up and coming like drug assisted therapy and how we're getting a lot more info about training here in North America, which is really exciting, I think. And, she was talking about a current client that she has that is using, like you mentioned, ketamine, and how she's been working with this client and has severe, deep trauma and very significant depression specifically is how her trauma has presented. And my colleague was saying like, at first, like she heard about this colleague doing this client using ketamine as like therapeutically. And she was like, oh, okay. Has worked wonders. She's like, it has kind of unblocked things for this client that like, and all of a sudden seeing like accessing these different parts of like their emotional state that they haven't been able to access, like humor, just like even tapping into grief and sadness that they've just been so depressed that they haven't been able to. And so how this ketamine treatment, like that's all that's changed, like nothing else. It's just since these have started, she's noticed like huge gains. And I've seen that with some of my clients because I've done some training in EMDR, but I'm not fully certified. So I don't believe in messing around with that until like you have the exact, there's a real protocol with EMDR.
Right.
So I often kind of refer to some of my colleagues here in my practice who will see like, so I will do like the pre-work with the client, getting them like basically ready for the EMDR work, processing some of the trauma. Right. And then I'll feel like, okay, we've hit a block. So then I'll send them to my colleague who will do the EMDR. And sometimes we'll actually do it in conjunction. Like I'll be in session with my colleague who's doing the EMDR work. And then I'm there to kind of do what you mentioned, like that kind of post containment integration work after the MDR. So we're kind of using that model, I think, already, but in North America, we're not specifically.
Sure.
But I do have clients I'll say that are using like microdosing, who swear. I have one client specifically, and he's been struggling for a long time, and he's just been starting to microdose, and like I'm seeing huge changes. Yeah. And he was like, scared to tell me, and I was like, no, like I'm all for that. Like that's amazing. I don't care what, like,
right.
And it's been really,
that's interesting because
really
it is so taboo now that I guess even to create a safe space in your practice that like, hey, if you want to try something else, like, you're not cheating on me here. Like if you
exactly.
Just be safe. Like make sure you have all the information. And if you need more information, maybe I can give it to you. So like they know that you're not there. So they will come back every week and give you a fee, but you're there to help them however that may be.
100%. And there's no judgment.
Walk that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not pretending I know, like, I'm one piece of the puzzle. I don't pretend to be the be all end all in terms of therapy. Like there's so many things that can be helpful.
I'm sure that there are some people that may be more conservative in what they would recommend or even accept. And like maybe there's a therapist that has their own control issues. They want to keep everything compartmentalized inside their practice.
For sure.
And then I would just assume like everyone has more of a, I don't know, they're more accepting of other modalities, and some just aren't because they're maybe more skeptical. But it seems like psychedelics are becoming more mainstream because we're reached a place that we all kind of need them on one level or another. But you said block, and I'll maybe go into how I got down this road because it's funny because I felt at that time. So I was coming back from living abroad, and I had traveled for a couple months. And I had a health scare while I was in Japan for like a month. And even though I had a really great time, that whole time I was kind of like seeing specialists in Tokyo and thought I had like a gastro problem. And it really ended up being literally absolutely nothing because I had an experience that turned into like a psychosomatic sort of situation. So luckily it was
common. So common.
But even when I got back and everything was fine, I realized I was good. I still started thinking like I've still got this bit of like leftover anxiety from this, and realized that like I've had this underlying like fear situation in my life, or that I just aren't listening to myself as well as I used to, for example. Like as a really small anecdote from how long you and I have known each other, like I remember you and I having chats when we were 18 or 19 about like creative things we wanted to do. I wanted to like move to New York. I think you wanted to do something similar.
Thinking
like
about that,
like, little dreamer sort of conversations we had at length, so many times. And I remember even, years later, I think it was 2017 or whatever, I saw the movie La La Land. And like, I remember I was on a date at the time, like I think it was like a first or second date. Otherwise, I think I just would have like bawled in the middle of the theater, like on the first.
I did.
Over, and I'm just a puddle of tears during this like cinematic musical. And I've seen it a few times since, but I really thought like, where did that come from? Like, where did that deep feeling come from? I thought I was going to hate this movie, to be honest. Like she wanted to go. I'm not a big musical fan to begin with, and all of a sudden, like I'm just holding back these tears. And so I think part of it, is that like back then when you're younger, well, hopefully, unless you do have trauma, like you're more emotion. You feel like I want to do this. I'm going to go do this. I want to go do this. I want to be this person. This is who I am. This is how I feel, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the more that we are, the more that we tamp down what our feelings are for the things that we want, I think we kind of give away a bit of ourselves over time. And so, so I think at that point and moving forward, I was thinking like, there's something in me that I'm not listening to, that I like, that there's a communication breakdown between my thinking self and my feeling self. And,
in my head,
at some point I'm going to have to reconcile that. And so I was speaking to friends of mine in the entrepreneurial community, And a couple of guys had went and done MDMA assisted therapy in Toronto. And so we were having dinner one night, and one guy, super great guy, super funny, was saying that he got his 80-year-old father to go and do it. And this guy, I think he said his father was from like an Eastern Bloc country. He's just like a really hard up old man that survived the war, is like fairly racist, like has all of these like not good attributes, but somehow his son got him to go and do this assisted MDMA therapy. And he said, Mike, he came out of that and he was 40% nicer immediately and 30% less racist. And,
wow.
and this is like the day of the, again, he was, I'm sure there's hyperbole in there and he was making a joke, but like you could tell that he saw a change in his father that he would never have expected otherwise.
And unlocked something for him.
For sure, because they say with MDMA, it quiets, again, I'm not a special on this. This is just things I've read. So please, fact check me. But like the MDMA is supposed to quiet the amygdala, which is supposed to be essentially emotion, but also the fear center. So if you quiet all the fear center, you just feel like safe and love, and you can see parts of your life and people in your life differently because they aren't wrapped in a sheath of fear or judgment of, will this person stop loving me? They did this thing to me, so I'm offended. Like all of these things, you don't really see that anymore. You just see love and who they are, for better or for worse. So that's essentially the idea of how they think perhaps you can begin to recode memories going through this journey with MDMA, because like EMDR, you're able to see it without the fear center on, and you're kind of just there are different modalities, but I think like the central idea for me seems similar. What do you think?
100%. I think, and what we know about trauma is that often when we're and back to what you said at the beginning, I just wanted to note, because I think it was such a key thing that you said, was trauma. We no longer think of trauma as like, we say big T traumas, right? Like abuse or an accident. Right. We think of, and trauma we now know is all about perception. It's all about how you perceive something. So like I could experience something, no issue. You could experience it, and the way you've perceived it is traumatic. So it's actually not about the event. It's about the perception of the event. It's about the impact of the event or chronic event, or like you said, we now know like living in poverty is trauma, right? So it's this repeated kind of chronic stress that becomes trauma over time. And it's the perception of that. Or if you lived in poverty and you lived with like a very beautiful household that kind of held you, and you were kind of bubbled, so to speak, from the impact of that, you maybe wouldn't have found your childhood traumatic, but someone else living in poverty in a different family maybe would have found that traumatic. So I just want to say that because you said that at the beginning, and I was like, that's such a brilliant point, that it's not trauma. When we say trauma, like when I say I'm a trauma therapist, people think, oh, like you work with like, ugh. And yes, I do, but I also work with just like with folks who are just like have, or I say to them like, that sounds like you have a really traumatic response to that. And they say, oh, no. But then when we unpack it, it's like, yeah, like your nervous system, your brain encoded that as trauma. Like you were so activated in your, like you said, like your limbic system, which is amygdala, hippocampus, like all those structures was so activated for whatever reason, how you perceived it, how you experienced it, that this is trauma. Right. So
that's really interesting. So if even when you're saying to clients that know they have something to be excavated and you say that sounds traumatic, they're like, hold on here.
They're like, no.
Because I think there's such a stigma around like, oh no, it wasn't that bad. But like the way you're emotionally dealt with it, like let's say how you said the person that maybe comes from a wealthy family and they don't have those trauma of poverty. But let's say they have a parent that for their entire childhood never said that they love them or
just as traumatic
appreciation or
just as traumatic. And
it's not like a it's not being hit, it's not being sexually abused, but like you go through life thinking that your closest caregiver doesn't care about you or like that is traumatic, and it will change the way that you deal with relationships. It will change how you
100%.
look at the world and yourself. So,
And can be just as traumatic and as damaging.
Little T trauma. I like that. I like that term.
And, I'm getting a lot of clients now. This is a side note, but it's really interesting kind of what you're saying. I'm getting a lot of clients now in their like 50s, 60s who are coming to therapy and saying like, I didn't have this bad childhood, but like I have all these things. And it's for exactly what you're saying. Like, they're like, I wasn't hit. Right. Like I wasn't hit. I wasn't sexually abused. Like what's my issue here? Like I should be okay. And, so you start to unpack it and realize like, you didn't have a very attuned caregiver. They didn't really meet your needs. Like you kind of, when you were upset or, no one really kind of told you that was okay or helped you manage it. Like that is just as damaging as being, differently, but like being hit as a child. So people are now, I think, starting to come and realize like, okay, just because you didn't have like the traumas that you're describing doesn't mean that it wasn't as painful and as impactful. So
I wonder if there's people that are like in their 50s and 60s or 40s and they're on Instagram and they're like, I was following this therapist and I think I need to talk to somebody. And like, because like sometimes you don't even think that these are things that are latent. You're just like, well, I didn't get thrown down a flight of stairs. I didn't see my mother or father throw anything at the other one. So I'm good, right? Like,
people invalidate their own pain, right? They invalidate themselves because they're like, well, people have it worse. But the whole thing is it's about perception. And like, if you're a highly sensitive person, I am one. The way my nervous system and the way I perceive things, can be like very like deep for me and for other folks who are like highly sensitive, right? So it also depends on like your temperament. Like there's so many factors that we're starting to really understand, I think, in the field. And I think that's why it's kind of opening the door to some of this, like what you're saying and realizing like there's blocks here and I don't know how to kind of unlock that. Yeah.
Well, the funny part is the last time I thought I was having a block with fear, I jumped out of a plane and it kind of worked if I'm being fair. Like, I went on skydiving.
That's called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, because I realized I needed to face some sort of big fear that I thought would be safe enough that would actually tell my brain it was terrified and then get through it. Like to start at like an advanced extreme point. And so I went to a skydive school outside of LA with like 4 or 5 guys. It was like this, it was a business trip, like a bunch of guys networking and just, anyhow, it was a great trip. And everyone was like really great. And everyone was like really on board for jumping out of this plane. And the plane I had opens up out of the back of it because it's like where the military trains.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm. And so the guy I was strapped to, we were doing a tandem jump. He's like, okay, Mike, so we're going to get up. We're going to, I'm slowly going to say go, and you're going to walk until you walk into the sky. And I'm like, no, okay. He goes, and then once you step out into the sky, he says, put your head back because I'm going to take us into a backflip. And I thought he was kidding. I was like, oh yeah, okay. And then I look back and his face is dead serious. I'm like, okay.
Oh my
God. So like,
I can feel that in my body. I'm like, I can feel that, like the fear of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like crazy.
And there were people that like professionals that were just practicing jumping out of the plane in front of us. So I watched them just go. We were at like 14,000 feet, which is supposedly pretty high for skydivers. And I've never in my life been as scared as I was before I stepped out into the sky. Like I remember thinking like, I can still bail out of this. I don't need to do this. Why am I doing this? This is very stupid. This is very dumb. And then I just went, and it was tremendous. Like I have the video on YouTube, so I'll show you because they filmed me before and after. But it helped. It made me realize like some fear is valuable, and some fear is not. So when I realized again in like 2018 or 19, whatever that, like I had this another block. Okay, how am I going to try to get through this? Actually, right now, doing this podcast is another version of me facing this fear to show that like it doesn't have power unless I give it power, right?
Absolutely.
And so when I found someone to basically to go through this process with of the assisted MDMA therapy, their protocol was somebody called me first, then they sent me a survey that I filled out in detail. And then someone called me to discuss the survey because I think they're trying to weed out people that actually might be on antidepressants. If you are, you have to go off them to do this sort of work.
Interesting.
If you actually are like, I probably can't use the word a crazy person, but like if they want to make
dysregulated,
mentally unstable, dysregulated,
right.
Thank you, is mentally unstable to be able to do this work. And I don't even know if dysregulated would be one of their qualifications, because like I know people that are more
dysregulated,
done this work.
Yes.
Right. So but I think they need people that might actually have like real mental health issues, like maybe schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, something that they can't control in that environment. I'm pretty sure. So then after you've went through all that and both sides are okay with whatever the fee is and the survey and the conversation, then you go into a 1 hour discussion with the therapist. The person that I had the session with, he's part of the Gestalt therapy school. I don't really know what that is. But he was a nice enough guy. And we just had a conversation for what the intention was going to be for this. And one thing that he said that really came true was like, listen, you can set as much intention as you want, and it's good to go in with a healthy intention, but they called it plant medicine. But he goes, the plant medicine or the MDMA is going to kind of take you where you're supposed to go.
Right.
So it's to have your intention, but also realize that this is going to be what it's going to be. And part of it is to let go and experience this. And then,
I love that.
And then, however long after that session, I showed up at 10 a.m. at this house that they were doing it. I walk in, you walk into the room, and
were you nervous?
For this, I wasn't. So my second, like 3 months later, I did an assisted MDMA psilocybin session, and I was terrified for that one. I was terrified for it. Like, and I slept like shit the night before, like only a few hours. I was really nervous. Like that therapist guy that was hosting it, I wasn't a huge fan of his. So like, it didn't feel safe for me. And I didn't realize that until I was in the session. But again, that's
podcast number 2.
Yeah, that is a bit divorced from the MDMA. Like they are two starkly different experiences. So the way I look at it is MDMA itself is to help you look at your life in a different way that you would not have been able to do without. Because if you're used to looking at the world through like anxious eyes or like hypervigilance, MDMA, while sitting down in a chaise lounge, will completely obliterate that hypervigilance, and you will see your life and your relationships in a very different way. The psilocybin, for example, though, I think it helps you see the universe in a different way and your position inside of it. So it's a much bigger.
So cool.
Yeah, it's a much bigger picture. So MDMA is like the pond, and the psilocybin is like, well, again, the universe that pond is in.
Like that's like kind of more like spiritual awakening kind of.
Yeah, stuff. For sure. Like, and you would like that conversation a lot, because the way that, like, I thought I was talking to plant gods and I understood it. Like my brain was explaining it to me through my coming out of Catholicism and the church's role and how humans communicate. It was a shit show. Yeah. So maybe there will be a part 2 of that topic, but we're already 30 minutes in. So
okay. Sorry.
So no. I could go on forever as well. Anyhow, so the MDMA, they give you the 2 tablets, and I think it's important to know that you're getting like pure MDMA, because I think if you go to a party and you take it, it really just could be uppers and you wouldn't know the difference.
And do they dose it based on like your weight and like how you tolerate?
That's a great question. I don't think so, maybe, but I think they just do it according to the MAPS protocol. MAPS is like the organization in the US that's studying all of this.
Neat.
And But they probably should. But like historically, like even medications have not been properly vetted for like women and men and different like.
Exactly. That's why I asked. Cause
Yeah, and they probably should. I don't know if they're doing that yet, but
okay.
they give you the 2 tablets, and then they give you some, I think, 200 400 grams of magnesium. Because apparently with MDMA, you're supposed to clench. So without that, then you kind of relax. So you basically just do that. They're recording everything in the room. There's you put a blindfold on and headphones, and you're listening to whatever music. If I were to do this again, I would choose my own music, because in the psilocybin
did you listen to?
I think they purposely put in more. I don't know what the term is, but like music that will make things more ominous and to send you in different directions, maybe make you face certain things. I don't like that. I would probably choose my own playlist if I were to do this again in this.
I think I know what your playlist would be.
Environment. No, it would no. No. Yeah, it would be nonstop 90s Euro. No, but I think it would still be instrumental. But I want it to be as neutral as possible without being like this really heavy, like horror movie sort of thing. Like it really took me to the path during that.
Which I just want to say, like, we know music accesses so many emotional parts in our brain, right? So like, that's so interesting. Like if you have a really like kind of like intense music, I wonder, like you're saying, how that would impact your trip, so to speak, right?
For example, my partner at the time, she also had this experience done. And she also went through this MDMA therapy as well. And a few weeks later, she was listening, because they send you what the playlist is on Spotify, so you can listen to it whenever you want. She was listening to it like on my condo patio and just meditating. And she said she felt like she went through half the journey again. And so she was processing more things again. So essentially you're just lying down and you're just hanging out. And then eventually the medicine, the MDMA kicks in, and you're just on a bit of a journey. Like, unfortunately, I was, you know me, I'm a very social person. So I was aware of there's also 2 sitters that are in the room that they will hold space for you, it's called. So like if you need some water, or if you have some questions, or like, so they're just there to help you have a good journey.
That's great. And that's so good.
Perhaps experiencing some sort of friction during your journey, they will help to guide you back to where you are, just so you have someone there. So me just being me, since I knew they were there, I was kind of like narrating some of the stuff I was going through. And if I were to do that experience again, I would probably just speak what I would like to speak and then go back inward. Whereas I think I was putting on too much of a show and telling like classic anecdotes or whatever, even like, just whatever, being a clown. And so at one point I'm in the, so there's one main thing that happened and a couple other insights that happened, because I was starting to see a bunch of relationships in my life that I was recreating based on a relationship with one of my parents. And I was so I'm seeing these relationships of people that I do love, and I kept saying the word acerbic, and I don't think I've ever said that word. And so like acerbic means with like a touch of acidity, right? And so like, is that right?
Yeah, I'm just writing it down because that's so right. Cool.
I just want to make sure I have the definition.
Yeah.
Right. So I was saying acerbic. And so I was seeing that some of these friendships in my life that had this touch of acid to it, and I didn't realize why, and I hadn't seen it before. And so what I started going through and examining, like both during the journey and afterwards in my integration, was like, okay, like why do I feel these relationships have this bit of acid to them? Is there any bit that I'm contributing? Do I give off this acidity on some level, and how? So like that took me down a super helpful path for some friendships that I decided to walk away from, and also like, like maybe these are things that that I could be better as being in my various relationships. But one of the biggest things is maybe 2 hours in or something like that, all of a sudden I started mourning the death of my grandparents. And they said after the session was over, they said, and this session goes from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. And so when the session was over, I was asking them, like, how long was I crying for? And they're like, oh, it was a while. and
you must have been so drained. You must have been so drained.
No,
were you drained
after the session I was on. No, I was super happy. I was the happy. You're just like joyous.
Oh, so like a release.
Yeah, like and I'm like my baseline is like fairly happy. You know what I mean? Like pandemic notwithstanding, but yeah, like you're amazing for that whole day, and then even for like a month, like you have this feeling of like joy and safety a little bit. But anyhow, so I'm like so you, like you said, I was crying for a while. You mean like 20 minutes, like 30 minutes, or like it was more like a few hours. Wow. And I had no idea. And so because I realized that like I'm in this room with these two strangers, I'm bawling, and I'm like, oh, just to let you guys know, I'm now mourning my nonni, my grandparents passing away, and they're like, oh, so do you feel like you had a chance to say goodbye? And I said, no, actually, I feel like I have them with me now, and I didn't before. And because when each of my grandparents, my mother's parents passed away, I was living abroad, and they both passed away suddenly and very quickly. So by the time they passed away, like there was no chance for me to go home. And so my parents, being as practical as they are, were like, well, like we have enough support here. Like, we know you have stuff, you don't have to come back. It's, it's fine. And for my grandfather, I didn't go back because like, I don't know. I wish I would have now, but I felt at that time I had in my head that I wanted to stay away from Canada for 1 full year. And like he'd already passed, like in my mind, there was like, I can't see him now. So what am I going to do? Just go there and be sad? But after doing the MDMA, I realized that's what you're supposed to do. Like, and you need to do, like, the grieving process,
closure,
is crucial. It's crucial. And also like to be there for your loved ones. Like, these are things that I just wasn't thinking at that time.
And the joint experience, right?
Right. And just to know that like there are people that love you, that you love, that you're together, and it kind of helps you to move forward with these things. And so I think, anyhow, so when my grandmother died, my brother was supposed to come over to see me in Europe like the next day and leave with his girlfriend. And so I thought I was canceling flights and flying home. And, my parents were like, well, like, listen, your brother will come over, you guys do what you're going to do, and you guys can, be together, mourn together. And then we'll come over in 3 weeks and we'll spend a month with you once this is done. And so I felt okay. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll stay here. But because he and I were having so much fun afterwards, like just traveling, like I never fully processed that grief either. Even though like I would have my own moments, I would cry and I would think about them. But like until this experience with MDMA, I never fully accepted what a gigantic part of my life they were. Like they were around. I was at their house every weekend for summers because my parents were both working. Like they would pick me up after school. Like they were there for everything. But I guess my emotional and limbic system tried to protect me from this sorrow. But I think the more we don't deal with these things, they calcify over time, and in our brain, in our body. And it's funny because while I was like having this catharsis of just like bawling during this process of mourning them, like I felt like a part in me untie. Like it felt like so when when people say that like this energy flow and all of these things, and like mostly I don't really subscribe to the majority of people saying those things, but now I get it. Like that it does make sense.
Release.
But I think we use these things as like this energy flow as like this higher vibe sort of conversation But the truth is, I think sometimes if there is a block, and and maybe I'm right again, like this is to give, this show is to, tear away some of my long held beliefs. And so
Right.
maybe those people, when they say the energy flow, maybe they're not, maybe all of them are right. I don't know, but I
maybe they can tap into a higher essence than we've been able to. And one thing, I just want to say something before you move on. Like what I wonder when you're describing like that, you didn't get to go home, you didn't get to do that morning, you didn't get to, really have like process the grief around your grandparents. What I wonder though is, even if you had gone home, if there would still have like not fully been able to allow yourself to process it and to grieve, right? Like I wonder if there would still have been more, because I think sometimes we only allow ourselves to kind of feel what we like. Our mind and our bodies are so protective, right? So like if there was so much pain there, I just wonder if you'd even had been able to access that going home, or whether like this kind of like MDMA kind of allowed you to access stuff that maybe you wouldn't have even been able to, no matter what you had done.
I think you're completely right, because like I'm more able to cry more freely now. Like if I'm at a movie, like I can feel like the sadness and the emotion, and I'm okay with it now. Whereas I think I was tamping it down, and maybe that was more like all that like be a man stuff you grow up with, that you're not supposed to, not supposed to cry and all of these things. But I think you're right. That's really interesting. I had never thought of that. I just thought that I didn't go back, and I should have, and if I did, then I would have been fine. But you're right. I never thought of that. But so the interesting part is that they say after the session, you need to go through and do integration. And so integration is essentially like I listened to myself on that tape in spurts, and I wrote down these ideas. And like a week later, I was journaling like my experience about mourning my grandparents. And I realized that my grandfather was like this father figure to me, like the secondary father figure to me, that I didn't really understand, because like his love was so ubiquitous and so like dependable and stable and all of these things. Like he kind of just slipped into the background, because like I had an uncle that was super funny, and so we got along really well, and he was cool, and I thought he was like, so
I just got goosebumps. I got goosebumps. So, he's like the secure base that was just always there, right? Like you're
right.
It's like,
and I never knew, I never understood it. So I'm journaling a week later. It's like on a Saturday. My girlfriend at the time was off doing something, and I'm sitting there like processing this. And as I'm typing, I'm just like, and like, but it just feels so good
for you. Yes.
It's like there's these things I didn't realize, and like now it's just coming out full force. And so I thought she was coming home in like 10 minutes. So I'm like, I better wrap this up. And then she calls me. She's like, "Oh, I'm just at a lunch with friends. We're having a good time. I'm going to stick around for another hour. I'll see you later." I'm like, "Okay, cool." And I'm like, right back at it. And it was tremendous. Like even now, I can feel how sad I am that they're not around anymore. And but I can also feel like how deeply loved I was, how deeply I loved them. Like all of these things that like wasn't even on my radar. Like,
what a gift. What a gift.
And that really that really changed how I looked at a lot of things. Like even at relationships, like just so going back to like even that Acerbic stuff, like I had to look at those relationships differently and have to be like, are these relationships good for me? Or am I unfortunately recreating relationships that I don't want? Because I think that they're going to be different, but they're not. Because like these are our archetypes of the same person. And even if they're slight degrees better, if I feel like there's acid in them, I can either choose to one, stay in them and try to improve them. And hopefully that person will come with me on this journey and we'll have a better, stronger friendship afterwards. Or I need to let them go if I realize that it's not a good idea for me. Or if we try to work on them and they don't work, then I let them go.
So was that like, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Was that afterwards? Did you find it was like, I'm just curious about like your process emotionally. Was that like, you came out of the session and you were like, boom, like clarity around that? Or was that kind of a slow then burn after where you started to really kind of process and look at things differently? Or did it feel like immediate, like, wow, I'm just seeing things so differently? Okay.
No, I think some people can do that. Like you and I even discussed before we started recording it, that like we have a propensity to kind of discount the things that we feel. So if we feel something, then we'll be like, I don't feel like that. Or like, no, and we just think our way, I think my way out of these things. And so once like the whole amygdala fear sort of judgment situation came back on board, you start thinking of also like real things, like this person's been in my life for 5, 10, 20 years, depending who the person is, and they've been good friends in this respect, but then not this respect. And like you really have to think of like, is this good for me or is this not good for me? And it's hard.
Sounds like you'd almost like tapped into your deeper, like sounds hokey, but your deeper knowing, like your core sense of self, where you're like, can you kind of like tap into that and just be like, okay, like I can see some clarity around more like the toxicity around things that maybe for whatever reason, and I think for everyone it would be different.
Right.
There was a bit of a, a shield around that. It sounds like you kind of could tap into your knowing.
Yeah, I think so. And it will also help me to see like even some of those relationships, that they were toxic, like my role in maybe some of their toxicity. Right. Because I don't ever think any relationship that isn't going well is ever one person's fault. Like almost never. And so at least allow me to see like, oh, like I was a bit acerbic here. I could have been a better friend there, or whatever the case may be. But
which is also a gift, right? That's also such a gift.
For sure. And these things are all really hard and really heavy, because you have to face kind of your own demons. But like, so not to use one of my own examples, another friend that went through this sort of process said he had a bunch of friends from his high school days that he would still talk to out of loyalty because they've been friends for so long. But he's done a lot of this work on himself and he's met new people. And after going through this process, he realized that like, oh, these things aren't serving me. And I think those things are really hard because you have this loyalty of time and you have these loyalty of experiences that you want to keep these people in your life, even though like sometimes they take a bit away from you. And I think it's impossibly hard because I do have friends, from high school or further that like I'm still friends with, but some that I've also had to, distance myself from, and maybe some that have also distanced themselves from me, to be fair. Right. Like I think I used to be a much more aggressive, impulsive, driven person than I've become. And so I think, and it's finding that balance as well, that like, because if you want to do something, you should go and do it if that's what you feel. But that's not to say that your actions will not affect people around you. And
absolutely.
But it was just interesting learning all of these things. So like, what do you say? So yeah, so even like the integration afterward, I told myself I would be open to whatever they recommended for integration. Because again, like this whole world to me, like I thought was pretty nonsensical going in. And I still do think that there is a fair amount of nonsensicality. That's a new word in this field. But like they sent me to one girl that was kind of just doing some like, not really massaging, not really tapping, but like in between, and also like chanting really loud chants. And so in the middle of that, I'm like, no, this one's out.
I can't buy in. I can't buy in.
Even my girlfriend at the time, she did the same thing and she walked out and we were both like, no. Then there was someone else that did like energy, I don't know if
exchange,
something like that. But you walk in and she had like a bit of a smash room where like you had bats and you could just yell and you could hit stuff and but then you would talk about stuff afterwards. And it was a really good like 1-2 punch. So I really think that I'm surprised if I think the majority of people would benefit going through at least the MDMA therapy, just to see life without like the judgment and fear that I think is part of what being human is. I think like
Absolutely.
Sorry, but yeah, and so I'm also monologuing, so please jump in anytime.
You're not monologuing, no. And I think we like, you gave me a kind of brief kind of overview of this a while ago that you had done this, and I was really intrigued. And this, I think, also was what sparked this podcast to have this like formal, I mean, it's not formal conversation, because I haven't really known anyone to have done it in the way that you've done it. I have friends who've done MDMA, but not in maybe in that way and such. So, and I think I said this to you at the time, and I still feel this way. And this is probably my critical lens coming in my work with trauma, is like, you're sure, you have your shit. We all do. Are we allowed to swear on this podcast? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
But you're a balanced, human who doesn't have any like significant mental health, doesn't have significant, childhood trauma. My wonder, because what you've talked about this unlocking in the scene, I wonder what would happen with someone who has maybe repressed traumatic memories, or I'm so curious. And I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm not saying that's bad or good. Maybe that would unlock stuff that they could then finally be able to process.
Right.
But I'm just so curious as to whether, because I've worked with people that like for years, and all of a sudden something happens and that we unlock some really, really intense memories that they've just
I think
repressed because they've needed to.
With talk therapy, like that's probably a credit to your skill in that environment.
Well,
I think with talk therapy, that's really, really tough to do. They must really trust you, and like that's
trust
tough.
Is huge, right? Well, and I really believe, I say this to clients all the time, like my role as a therapist isn't to push people into places they're not ready to go, right? Because I think our psyche and our mind is so powerful that it builds, like, for lack of a better word, defenses for a reason, right? Like we build that up because we're not ready to look at it. We're not ready to process that. It's too painful that we may not be able to, it may be more harmful to bring it out than to repress, right? So that's where I'm curious as to, would the MDMA bring something up for someone that maybe they didn't have the resources yet to be able to handle, internal resources like coping and such. So, which is why I think it's so great that they do this like screening. Like if I was to ever train in this and it was, in a perfect world, legal in Canada and all this stuff, I'm like, that would be my piece. I think I would really want to get into would be like, what is the risk here? Like, do you have the emotional capacity, resources emotionally, meaning like, can you ground? Do you have the ability, like safety within yourself? Because that's what we do in trauma work, is for the first, like, it can be a really long time. And this is Judith Herman's model. You build safety, you build trust, because you can't unlock trauma if there's not that internal safety there and trust within the relationship. So I'm just so, curious as to how that would translate into like, the world of I can give you. Yes, please.
So this was a friend of mine that they had a traumatic experience in their past, and it was something that they knew was a big part of their trauma response and the person that they are in the present. But it seemed like they couldn't ever actually fully look at that scenario. And so what they told me is that when they went through this assisted MDMA therapy, is they literally spent the entire, how long were we there for? 10 until like 7 hours, just reliving that moment.
Oh,
because
was it therapeutic or was it harmful?
Well, I think they did it. The MDMA, I think they did MDMA only twice, and then they ended up doing an MDMA psilocybin for a third one, like a couple years afterwards. But they said it took away a lot of like the emotionality, like the anxiety around that, because they could see both people, both themselves and the other person in the environment.
That's so interesting.
Without that fear and judgment and shame and all the things that was wrapped up in that moment. And so they said they just and they didn't say anything. So where I was like having a bit of a talk show with the people holding space for me, like throwing out one-liners, like my friend was just like sitting there for 7 hours looking at that moment, because I think maybe emotionally they were constantly trying to pretend it wasn't there. And it's like the whole thing, like, don't think of a white elephant. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things where it's like, if you're trying to forget these things actively, it's always there.
Well, and that's a big piece of trauma work in talk therapy, right? We call it trauma narrative, and I take people through their trauma narrative, and we look at it from different angles. Sometimes we look at it as a movie, like let's be outside of it and narrating what happened, right? And people often, when they recount their trauma, they're not often falling in a mess like you think they would be. They're often very like dissociative. They're often very like removed from their affect and their emotion. So a big piece of the work is getting them to tune into the affect, so we can start processing like the feelings that they were feeling. So it's so cool to me, because it's like, these are things that we do, but can we really access it, right? Like, can I really like access it through the deep verbal work that we do with folks? And I use different modalities, not just talk. Like, we do like meditation, we do all these things, but without the assistance of like drugs, like, can we really access what we need to access? I don't know.
If you ever go through the process of having this experience, I would love to be one of the first people to.
I will
experience.
We can podcast on it,
Yeah, I didn't mean that, but that would be great. But
no.
Just because I know you so well, that I would like to see like if your worldview changes and how you process things in your life, and like I'm curious about all of it, because like you said, you're one client with the ketamine that it made a gigantic leap forward in their therapy. I've also met people and listened to people online that have tried ketamine and it did nothing for them. Like, if anything, they were sick from it. Right. So like, I don't think we know which of these medicines modalities should be used for what people or what situations. And
but isn't that everything?
Right. Well, because
isn't that everything?
We've had 50 years or longer of nobody exploring this, because it's more like, that's more of a political conversation, but like people that don't want to explore these things because they think they will make them more open. Like there's Neil, the comedian Neil Brennan had a joke. He's like, no one ever does like any sorts of drugs and come out more conservative. Like that's just not a thing that's ever happened.
Yeah. Right. Open your mind. And back to your point about like, what is this used for what, but isn't that everything? Like, that's one of my big pet peeves in the therapy world, is thinking that every client, one size fits all. Like, okay, cognitive behavioral therapy for everyone. Or like, so for me, I'm like, I get to know a client before I do any kind of interventions, because I'm like, one thing might work really well for one person, that's not going to work for somebody else, depending on a whole variety of things. And I think that's my point with this MDMA. Like, I'm curious. So it sounds like it was really great for you, but I think we're being naive to ourselves to think that everyone's gonna have this positive experience. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, where is the safety measures in that? For which folks is that not going to be a therapeutic experience, but actually a re-traumatizing experience? Like, right. I mean, like, of course, there's going to be folks that it isn't positive for. So I'm just, and there's not enough research, so we don't know. And it's maybe so individualized, Right.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And, so I think that's most of it. I'm trying to think of what else came from that journey. And, I think that's the most of it, because I think a lot of these things flow from that central idea of being able to feel my place in my grandparents' world and their place in mine, and being able to emotionally digest all of those feelings, and then keep that with, I guess staying with that analogy, once I can digest all of those feelings and that love, like I'm also then filled with the nutrients of everything that I've then understood, and that flows to a lot of my relationships. And it's not to say that like after someone does these MD, any of these drugs, all of a sudden you're self-actualized in these things.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like you still have to deal with the majority part of you, but I think we can just try to be a little bit better, or see our life with a little bit more compassion, see other people with a little bit more compassion. I think I do have more empathy. Like my register is wider as far as my emotional range and my empathy register, I think, and which I really don't believe I would have had it without the use of MDMA. And I again, like, listen to the scientists that are studying this thing, not to me. But
no, it's such a great example though of how it can, like there's like block, right? Unlocking, like, yeah. Would you do it again? Would you do it again?
I don't know. Maybe we will do a part 2, and because my psilocybin MDMA combo was a little traumatic. To go back to like little T traumatic. So there was a lot that came out there, because they say like psilocybin has you face certain things, but sometimes like it's more abstract. Like MDMA, like you know what you're looking at, you know what you're feeling. Like all these things are very cut and dry for what they are. Whereas the psilocybin, I had a friend who did it, said that he was a little apple walking in forest, like all, you know what I mean? Like that's a lot different than
my grandparents love.
You know what I mean? Like that's
yeah.
So
well, isn't that like shrooms in general? People can have like great trips and really scary trips where they are very distressed.
For sure, and they say that you should. The people I went to, their idea was like, if you have the MDMA, then it quiets the fear center.
Oh, it's together. I see.
And it allows you to see this scary stuff with less of like an emotional trigger.
Okay.
I don't know that I necessarily believe that. I'm wondering if, on some level it's true, because I did come out of that still a little bit like feeling okay, like the next day. But the months that went on afterwards, I was way more anxious.
Oh my gosh, I'd love to hear about it. I would love to hear about it.
Yeah. So we'll do it next time. But I guess, where do you hope that like these psychedelic therapies go to in Canada, and like how would you like to see them used?
I think this is going to sound a little bit like rigid of me, but I think the big piece is the support around it. So in a way that is regulated, that we can have like harm reduction around that, like the supportive kind of, like you said, like having someone in the room with you, having someone brief you before, having someone follow up. Right. So it's people know what they're doing, because I think sometimes in the mental health world, like people have the best intentions, but sometimes they can cause a lot of harm, right? If they're not trained properly, if they don't know what it is that they're doing, because there's real people that you're working with, right? It's real pain. So, I mean, I would love to see it like legalized here, but in a way that's safe, and controlled. That's not just like, let's go out in the fields and do this and have some hippie that's gonna, and there's a place for that. And I'm, whatever, like, great. Ooh, that's awesome. But in terms of like a therapy setting, I think in a way that is really, really like safe emotionally for folks, and a lot of the pre and post kind of containment is the word that comes out around that is what I would see.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Hold on. Am I way too dark right now? Or is it good enough still?
No, I can see you.
All right, good. Whatever, first episode. You gotta,
it's
get another ring light in here. It'll be fine.
Charm. This is the charm of it. This is when you look back, when you're famous and you look back and you're like, wow, look at like the, how basic it was. Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah, we'll see. So far, it's been fun. I've had a great experience so far. Like,
it was super fun.
You are one of my favorite people, and it's been helped to make this easier to get into. And one last thing I want to say about these these therapies? Because I'm hearing that a lot of people are doing them in like these group scenarios where like even the practitioners are high as well, like ayahuasca or
That's my point. Yes.
and
Yes.
I think that stuff is so dangerous. Like I'm sure many people would disagree with me. But all I know is that like I know 100% I would not have had the experience that I did have that I just described if it would have been in a group scenario. Because
I think you're totally right.
Of, you know what? And again, maybe I'm wrong because the medicine was going to do what the medicine was going to do anyway. But again, but if I'm aware people are there, I don't think
exactly.
Yeah, I'm more concerned with them than I am with what I'm there to do.
Or re-traumatizing, right? Like if you saw someone start losing it, let's say like bringing up something, and like how is that going to impact you, right? Like you're gonna absorb that, like those. Talk about energy, those emotional exchange, like the energy that would go back. And like, I 100% agree with you. Like maybe with the right people, really safe people, maybe with like really close friends or whatever. Sure. Right. But I hear you. I totally agree with you on that.
No, because I have heard that some people on MDMA or especially psilocybin, like MDMA sometimes just like, actually even during the session, now that I think about it, like I was doing a lot of rocking at one point.
Well, that's regulating. You're regulating. That's regulating. You're regulating your nervous system. That's what we do. That's why babies rock.
Oh, interesting. Because there was other parts where they say sometimes if you have like trauma locked in, and sometimes people will be more rigid in their movements, like they don't want to dance or they don't want, or they move certain ways. And so once you have this block removed, then all of a sudden people are like flailing their arms and shaking their legs and they're on the ground, like just shaking around. And like you might look like you're possessed, but your body is finally like celebrating the fact that it doesn't have.
Oh, that's a nice way
to hold themselves back.
I love that.
But all right.
Well, this was fun.
I think we did it.
I think we did it too. I think we did good.
No Less podcast with the esteemed Kendra Hollidge. and as it says, I'm still going to go by Michael. I'm probably going to have a new last name since, like we said, historically, nobody can pronounce my.
Oh, but I love your last name.
That's very sweet of you. But you should ask literally all the friends I've ever had and all the teachers I've ever had in my life. And you know that a change just for this podcast is necessary. So stay tuned for what that name turns into.
I can't wait.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Here for being the inaugural guest and your insight.
No, I'm honored.
As always, I'm sure will help a lot of people out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.